She was not supposed to be at the morning distribution, but no one had told her not to come, and so she came. That was how most things worked in Serafina Voss's life. There were no direct rules against her presence in any specific place. What existed instead was the slow, accumulated pressure of everyone's assumption, the sideways glances, the slight shifting away, the conversations that changed pitch the moment she walked into a room. It was never organized enough to be called deliberate cruelty, but it was thorough enough to produce exactly the same effect. She had learned to read all of it, as clearly as written text, and she had learned, more importantly, to keep moving anyway. The morning distribution took place in the east courtyard of the Crescent Vale Pack Estate every third day. Supply wagons came in from the outer territories, and ranked members collected their household allowances in the rough order that pack hierarchies always produced, without anyone needing to announce it. Senior enforcers near the front, warriors in the middle, omegas toward the back, household workers and unranked individuals at the very end. Serafina stood at the very end, as she always did. The morning was biting cold, the kind of early-season cold that had real teeth in it, and the other pack members around her moved in the easy clusters of people who shared the same world. They talked in low voices. A few of the estate children chased each other around the edge of the line, until someone's mother caught one of them by the collar. Two warrior-ranked women near the middle were discussing something about the southern boundary that made one of them laugh, a full, unguarded laugh, the kind that belonged to a person who felt completely at home in the space she was standing in. Nobody spoke to Serafina. She was not offended by this. Offense required a foundation of expectation, and she had stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. She simply watched, stored the details the way she always stored details, and waited her turn. When she reached the front of the line, the supply clerk, a compact and efficient woman named Helene, who had managed distribution records for as long as anyone in the pack could remember, found her entry, checked the box beside it, and slid a bundled package of kitchen supplies across the table. Soap, salt, dried spices, the week's flour allocation, noted on a small slip tucked inside, standard issue. Then Helene's pen stopped moving. She looked up, not unkindly, but without particular warmth either, the way one looked at a form that had flagged itself for administrative attention, rather than any human reason. This entry marks you as unranked. You're still listed under the Voss household register. Are you aware that the Voss household's pack standing is currently under review? Yes, Serafina said. Thank you. She picked up the bundle and walked back toward the kitchen wing. Under review. Those were the clean, official words for what was happening to her father. Gerald Voss had missed 3 consecutive tribute payments to the Alpha Council. In Crescent Vale, tribute was not simply money. It was a formal quarterly declaration of pack loyalty, a statement that a household was maintaining its obligations and deserved to hold its registered status. 1 missed payment could be attributed to misfortune. 2 was a warning. 3 was the beginning of a process that ended only one way. She went straight to the kitchen and organized the new supplies by category. Fire lit, water heated, bread dough for the second rise, set on the warm stone shelf, soup on the far burner. Her hands knew all of it by long habit, and while her hands worked, her mind ran through the numbers she had been working with for the past 2 weeks. 9 days. She had 9 days before the interpack exchange. She had spotted the notice 9 days ago, pinned in the lower corner of the public board in the central hall. Small, official, easy to miss if you were not already looking for it. She had read it twice, memorized the date, and walked on without breaking her stride. That evening she had returned to the estate library and pulled the volume of Interpack Common Law she had read once before, but now needed to read again, with specific attention to one particular section. Section 12 was very precise. An individual with no independent pack registration, no wolf ranking, and no family claim due to household standing revocation, was classifiable as a free placement. A free placement could be voluntarily assigned through the exchange by the household head of record before the revocation was formally processed, provided the assignment was registered 5 or more days before the exchange date, and the individual met the minimum criteria for labor classification. The criteria were not complicated. Physical health, age above 16, no documented dangerous behavioral history. She met every one of them. She had always been physically healthy. She had no behavioral record. She was 22 years old. What her placement category would be was equally uncomplicated. She had no wolf. which meant no territorial contribution, no defensive function, no tracking ability, non-specialist labor, kitchen work, household service, supply organization, agricultural support. These were the boxes she fit. She had known this since she read the section, and she had not been surprised by it. Surprise, in her experience, was something that happened to people who had been able to afford hope long enough for it to become an expectation. Peg arrived in the kitchen at 7, set her coat on the hook by the door, and made herself a cup of tea from the small kettle she always brought. She came to stand beside Serafina at the counter, cup in hand, and said to no one in particular, "Cold morning." "Very," Serafina agreed. Peg was 50 years old, soft-spoken, and had worked in this kitchen for 3 decades. She had never, in all the time Serafina had known her, asked a personal question or made an uncomfortable comment. She treated Serafina the same way she treated the bread dough and the soup stock and the well-used set of kitchen knives, as something that was simply present in the kitchen and deserved to be handled with reasonable care. In the quiet economy of kindness that Serafina had learned to live on, that put Peg near the very top of a short list. Addie came in at 7:30 and went directly to the bread station, keeping to her own end of the room the way she always did, not mean about it, just young and uncertain, the way a person was when they had been handed a set of unspoken rules about someone and did not entirely know what to do with them. Serafina let her be. She had no interest in making anyone more uncomfortable than they already were. She just needed to get through the 9 days. The morning kitchen work had a rhythm to it that required almost no conscious attention once learned well enough, and she had learned it better than she had learned anything else in her life. She shaped the remaining bread, checked the soup stock, started the preparation for the midday meal, and let her mind run the same quiet accounting it had been running since the night she spotted the exchange notice. What she had, what was coming, what she could and could not prepare for. She was not afraid in the simple sense of the word. She was something more specific than afraid, and more complicated than calm. She was a person who had spent 22 years developing a thorough and honest accounting of her own situation, and the accounting had always contained this possibility, low in probability while Gerald's standing held, but never absent. She had known, in the way she knew things she had not been told directly but had understood through years of careful observation, that her position in this household was contingent, in a way that most people's positions were not. An unranked wolf, an individual without independent status or scent profile, a household dependent who could only exist within a registration structure she did not herself control. These were categories that carried legal weight that everyone preferred not to examine directly, but when examination became necessary, it produced conclusions she had already drawn. The practical advantage of having drawn them ahead of time was that she did not need to draw them now, in shock, while simultaneously managing fear. She could simply act on the preparation she had already done. There was one thing she had not adequately prepared for, which was the specific texture of a known departure being 8 days away, rather than a vague future possibility. She had understood it intellectually since the notice. She was now understanding it in her body, in the way that near things felt different from far ones even when you comprehended them equally well. The kitchen felt slightly more familiar than it usually did. The worn stone of the counter under her hands had a more distinct quality to it. She registered this in the usual clinical way she registered most things, and noted that this was what it felt like when a place became more itself in your awareness, because you were beginning to understand you were going to leave it. Peg left at noon, as she always did, giving Serafina a small nod before she reached for her coat on the hook. She was almost at the kitchen door when she stopped and turned back, and Serafina looked up from the cleanup to find Peg looking at her, with an expression she had never quite seen on Peg's face before, something considered and direct, the face of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to do something, and had decided the right moment was now. From her coat pocket, Peg produced a small paper envelope and set it on the counter nearest Serafina. The envelope was folded shut rather than sealed, small and careful. "I found it in the kitchen garden at the end of last autumn," Peg said. Her voice was as plain and unperforming as it always was, the last rose of the season. "I pressed it because I thought it was the kind of thing that should be kept. I've been meaning to give it to someone who would keep it properly." She looked at Serafina steadily. "I think that's you." Serafina looked at the envelope. She understood from its size what was inside without opening it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice stayed even. "I'll keep it carefully." Peg nodded once, without ceremony. and left. Serafina picked up the envelope and held it in both hands for a moment. She felt the specific quality of receiving unexpected kindness during a difficult period, the combination of warmth and weight that the two things produced together, neither canceling the other out. She slipped the envelope into her apron pocket and went on with the afternoon. That evening, after the supper meal was prepared and served and the kitchen was in order for the morning, she went to the estate library one last time. She had no specific research need. She had memorized the relevant sections of the common law, had read every text the library held that touched on her situation, had gathered every piece of information available to her inside these walls. But she wanted to spend some time in the room where she had spent the most meaningful hours of her 22 years, in the way that a person spent time in a place when they suspected they were coming to the end of being in it. She found the thin volume tucked where she had returned it, behind the administrative records in the eastern alcove. She did not pull it out. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at its spine for a moment, and thought about page 47, and the interrupted bond, and the mark that should not have been possible, and she let herself hold the full weight of not knowing, which was something she had become quite skilled at, because not knowing had been the predominant state of her entire adult life. She went back to her room. She took the paper envelope from her apron pocket and set the pressed flower very carefully on the shelf beside her 3 books. She stood back and looked at the arrangement for a moment, the books and the flower and the plain shelf in the narrow room, and she thought, "This is everything I am taking from this place. These are the things that are actually mine." Then she packed the bag, the books first, the knife from the bottom of the wardrobe, the pressed flower, lifted carefully from the shelf and slipped inside the front cover of the pack history, where the pages would protect it without pressing it further. A change of clothes. The small personal items she owned that were genuinely hers rather than estate property. When the bag was packed and standing by the wardrobe door, she sat on the bed and pressed her hand against the mark on her shoulder, and felt it hum, warm and constant in the dark. 9 days, she had thought a week ago. Now it was 8, and tomorrow morning would be 7, and the morning after that would be 6, and each of them would feel like its own particular length, until the morning, when the number reached 0, and she would face what she had been preparing to face. She pressed 2 fingers against the mark on her left shoulder as she moved between the stove and the prep counter. It was a habit so old she rarely noticed herself doing it. The mark was warm this morning, a little warmer than its usual background hum, though still within the range she privately thought of as normal, which was itself a strange word to apply to anything about her situation. The mark had appeared on the morning of her 16th birthday. She had gone to sleep the night before perfectly ordinary, slightly anxious about the emergence window, the way everyone was in those final days, running through what Dr. Harlan had told her to expect. She had woken to find it pressed into her shoulder, as though it had always been there, silver, slightly raised, a curved and branching design, about the size of her palm, sitting exactly where a bonding mark would sit on someone whose wolf had emerged and recognized a mate. No wolf had emerged. Dr. Harlan had confirmed that over 3 careful examinations across 2 weeks. Not delayed, not dormant, simply not present. And yet the mark was there. Bonding marks, every text she had subsequently found agreed, were a wolf-to-wolf phenomenon. The resonance required to form one needed 2 active wolf souls. It was not transferable to a wolfless individual by any mechanism anyone had documented. Every reference said the same thing. The mechanism was understood. The mark on her shoulder was not supposed to be possible. Gerald had instructed Dr. Harlan not to speak of it, and Serafina never to discuss it, and the matter had been officially closed. She had not closed it in her mind. She had simply learned to carry it quietly. She had spent years searching the estate library for anything that offered an explanation. Most of what she found confirmed the same impossibility the pack physician had described. But 3 weeks ago, reorganizing the eastern reading alcove after a council sub-meeting, she had found a thin volume tucked behind a row of administrative records, a personal account from an Ashbourne archivist, nearly 200 years old, cataloging unusual emergence cases. On page 47, buried in a paragraph the archivist had clearly considered a minor footnote, was a reference to a bonding mark appearing on a wolfless individual. The result, the original record suggested, of a wolf bond, initiated during an emergence crisis, and then interrupted before either party was conscious of what had occurred. The outcome had not been documented. She had read it 3 times, closed the book, and sat without moving for a while. An emergence crisis, an interrupted bond, a mark that should not have been possible, appearing anyway. She had put that knowledge in the same place she put all the things she could not immediately act on, and she had not allowed herself to build hope on it. Hope, built on a single old footnote, was the most expensive kind. She knew this. But she had not been able to quite close the thought entirely either, and in the deep quiet of her room at night, with her hand against the mark and the warm, steady hum of it coming up through her palm, she let herself wonder. Just barely. Just enough to keep the thought alive without letting it cost her anything she couldn't afford. The headcount meeting that afternoon was routine. Alpha Corvin, lean, gray-haired, a man whose authority was built on careful management rather than any exceptional force, read through pack business at the front of the hall, while his ranked members arranged themselves in their customary positions. Warriors and senior enforcers to the left, Omegas and support-ranked wolves to the right, household workers and unranked individuals near the back. Serafina stood against the wall at the very back, between two older women who cleaned the Alpha's personal suite, and a young garden worker too nervous to look at anything directly. She listened to the full meeting and watched the room the way she had been watching rooms her entire life. The enforcer captains exchanged glances during the interpack discussion that suggested the official summary was much shorter than the actual conversation happening behind closed doors. Two of the higher-ranked Omegas whispered with expressions that read as worried rather than curious. Alpha Corvin's jaw was tighter than his usual baseline. None of it was her business. She stored it all anyway. Information was the one resource she had that no one could take from her. The conversation that mattered came after the meeting, in the stone corridor between the main hall and the kitchen storage passage. Two enforcer lieutenants, Donovan, who was perpetually anxious and had a habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh when stressed, and Soren, who was quiet and economical with words, stopped just inside the corridor to finish a conversation they had clearly started elsewhere. Neither noticed Serafina moving along the far wall with her herb basket. "Gerald's situation is worse than people think," Donovan said. His fingers were already moving. 3 months. 2 extensions already given. The council is finished being patient. "Does he have assets to offer?" Soren asked. "Nothing that transfers. The house is estate property. His son joined the Westfield Pack last year. That's gone." Donovan paused. He chose his next words with the care of someone trying to be factual rather than cruel, and not quite managing either. "His only current entry on the household registry is the Hollow Girl." Soren was quiet for a moment. "The exchange runs at month's end." Neither of them said anything else. Serafina walked past them and kept walking. She delivered the herbs. She completed the afternoon tasks. She prepared the evening meal, and cleaned the kitchen, and organized the next day's supply list. All of it exactly as she always did, because the work still needed doing, and because the shape of a normal day was one of the few things that held steady when everything else was shifting. That night she passed Gerald in the main corridor. He was coming from Alpha Corvin's office, and she could read the meeting's outcome in his posture before she was close enough to see his face. Shoulders back, jaw forward. The lockdown expression of a man absorbing something badly while refusing to let it change how he walked. He looked at her with the combination she had learned to recognize over the years: resignation, and something else underneath it that moved too quickly to identify properly. "Go on," he said. She went on. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, in the dark, with her hand flat against the mark on her shoulder. The silver warmth of it came up through her palm, steady and unchanged, unhurried by anything the day had brought. Outside the narrow window, the stone outer wall of the estate was the same gray it had always been. 9 days. She organized her small room methodically. The 3 books she would bring, the knife her birth mother had left her, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the wardrobe. The pressed flower from Peg, kept at the back of the shelf where it could not be damaged. She set her bag beside the wardrobe door. Then she sat on the bed and began, carefully and without panic, to plan. She was not going to make this harder than it needed to be. She was not going to let anyone see her be afraid, not because she was not afraid, but because fear in front of an audience had never once served her in any useful way. She had survived 22 years in a place that had never quite found a category for her. She had read every book she could find. She knew the law and the lore and the practical reality of what was coming, and she was going to walk into it the same way she walked into everything, with her eyes open. The mark on her shoulder was warm in the dark, and it hummed its quiet, persistent hum. and she pressed her hand against it one more time before she lay down. Whatever was waiting on the other side of 9 days, she would face it. She did not know yet how right she was about that, or how wrong she was about being alone and facing it. The transit wagon came before the morning light had fully strengthened. She heard it at first light, the particular weight of a commercial vehicle, heavier than a supply delivery, with the measured and professional pace of people who made this kind of journey regularly, and saw no reason to hurry it. She was already dressed. Her bag was beside the wardrobe door exactly where she had set it. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the sounds of the estate organizing itself around the arrival. Diane's voice somewhere near the front of the house, directing someone with the crisp efficiency of a person who wanted something handled and behind her as quickly as possible. Gerald's voice in response, lower, briefer. 2 sets of footsteps that moved with the economy of people paid to complete a task, rather than to make anyone comfortable while they did it. She waited the exact amount of time it took to determine that no one was coming to her room to tell her anything. Then she picked up her bag and went to the front hall herself. Gerald stood by the main door. 2 men in the neutral gray coats of exchange transit workers stood just inside the entrance. Broad-shouldered, professional, carrying a compact document case. Diane stood slightly behind Gerald with the expression she wore when she had decided the correct response to a situation was to have no visible response at all. The taller transit worker, close-cropped gray hair, the air of someone who had processed every possible human reaction to this kind of morning and been moved by none of them, looked up when Serafina came in with her bag already packed. Something recalibrated briefly behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Something more like a minor adjustment. "Ready?" he said, not unkindly, just factual. "Yes," she said. The processing in the front hall was efficient. The shorter worker had a compact medical kit and checked her pulse, her eyes, and her general physical condition in under 3 minutes, recording everything on a form with his pen. The taller one spread the documents on the hall table, and Gerald went through them one by one, signing where indicated, keeping his eyes on the pages. She watched her father's face during this. His expression stayed locked in its controlled position the entire time, and he did not look at her. She had expected this. She was not newly hurt by it. The last document was the transit registration. The taller worker filled in her name, age, and classification, then produced a small metal bracelet from the case and held it out. "Left wrist," he said. She extended her wrist. He fastened the bracelet with a small tool. The number stamped into the metal was 47. She looked at it for a moment without expression, then put her arm down. "We can leave when you're ready," the worker said. She looked at Gerald one last time. He was looking at the table. "I'm ready now," she said. The wagon's interior was narrow, a canvas top over 2 wooden bench seats, each with a thin, worn cushion. 2 other people were already seated inside. A young man of about 20, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed on his feet, who did not look up when she entered, and would not look up at any point during the journey. A woman of perhaps 50, sitting at the far end of the opposite bench, who watched everything, with the steady, exhausted attentiveness of someone who had survived difficult things before, and had developed watchfulness as a way of getting through the next one. The woman met Serafina's eyes briefly, as she settled onto the bench. Something in the woman's expression shifted. Not pity exactly, more like a quiet recognition. "First time?" she said. "Yes," Serafina said. The woman nodded and looked away. No further questions. Serafina found this deeply considerate. The journey took most of the day. The road out of Crescent Vale moved through the pack's outer farmland, then the managed forest of the territorial boundary, then the broader and flatter landscape of the interpack transit zones, land that belonged formally to no pack, maintained under the common agreements for exactly this kind of commerce. The exchange held its charter on this land by long-standing arrangement, which was why it had operated continuously, for as long as anyone had records of it. No single pack could shut it down when it became inconvenient, because it did not belong to any single pack. She watched the landscape through the gap in the back canvas, where the flap did not quite close all the way. The Crescent Vale farmland gave way to the boundary forest, which gave way to the open transit plain. She had spent 22 years inside those borders. She watched them disappear without sentiment, and noted what replaced them with the same careful attention she gave to everything she had not seen before. The exchange facility was a complex of clean stone buildings, arranged around a central hall. Practical, well-maintained, Deliberately neutral in character, the kind of space designed to belong to no particular territory, and therefore to offend no one. Which also meant, it felt as though no one was specifically responsible for the comfort of anyone inside it. The transit workers delivered her and the other 2 passengers to an intake corridor, where a processing clerk, a young man with a ledger and the air of someone who had done this often enough to find it unremarkable, took their information in turn. Her intake took 4 minutes. Name, age, origin pack, classification. The clerk noted the absence of a wolf and the absence of a scent profile, wrote hollow emergence in the relevant field without pausing, and gave her a medical form to take to the health station at the corridor's end. The medical clerk there was equally efficient, checked everything that needed checking, signed off, and handed her a facility assignment card. Lot 47. Waiting Area 7. Waiting Area 7 was a medium-sized room, with 12 wooden chairs, arranged in a loose circle, a small table, with a water pitcher, and several cups, and 11 other individuals in various stages of processing. She took the chair nearest the window, narrow, set high in the wall, showing only the gray sky above the roofline, and spent the afternoon watching the room. People in situations like this, she had always found, tended to sort themselves into those who went very still, and those who could not stop moving. The room held both kinds in roughly equal numbers, with a few who cycled between the two depending on the hour. She said very little to anyone, not because she was unfriendly, but because she did not have the energy to offer comfort she was not genuinely feeling, and she suspected most of the people around her were in the same position. She slept badly that night on the narrow facility cot, but she slept. She had taught herself to sleep in difficult conditions years ago. The alternative, lying awake cycling through possibilities she had no power to change, was a worse use of the hours. The auction was scheduled for 9 in the morning. At 8:30, a facility attendant led the 12 of them from the waiting room, down a long stone corridor that smelled of old wood and cold air, and up a short flight of steps to the platform in the central hall. The hall was large, cold-lit, with high, narrow windows letting in pale morning light and iron torch brackets along the walls for the corners the light did not reach. The platform rose 3 feet above the main floor and ran the full front width of the hall. The buyers were arranged below in the casual, practical order of people at a commercial event, some seated in the provided chairs, some standing along the walls, some moving between small groups and speaking in low voices. The low noise of it carried up to the platform in a way that was oddly formal, like the pre-performance sound of a hall before something began. The auctioneer was a businesslike man in his mid-50s, plain brown coat, ledger in hand. He moved through the lots with professional efficiency and described each one in brief, factual terms. Serafina listened to the descriptions of the others on the platform and noted what language was used: wolf ranking, scent profile, skill category, territorial origin. She noted the emphasis placed on each, and she noted what was said when the auctioneer reached her number. Lot 47, female, 22 years of age, origin, Crescent Vale Pack, classification, hollow emergence, no wolf confirmed, no scent profile recorded, physical condition, excellent, labor experience, kitchen preparation, household maintenance, storage organization, herb management, starting bid at the minimum non-specialist rate. She stood straight and looked at the far wall. She had decided the night before that looking at the buyers would not help her, and might make her feel things she could not afford to feel right now. So she picked a point on the far wall of the hall and gave it her steady, quiet attention. The bidding for Lot 47 was slow. A buyer from the Northridge Pack offered the minimum for standard kitchen placement. A medical compound from the Eastern Territory bid slightly higher, specifying a need for someone organized enough to handle supply inventory and record maintenance. 2 other bids followed, small, careful increments from buyers who were not competing seriously but were keeping themselves in play in case the price fell to something attractive. The auctioneer's voice was steady and professional. The pace was unhurried. The bids accumulated in the slow, calculating way of people weighing cost against utility for a practical purchase. 4 minutes into the bidding, the doors at the back of the hall opened. The sound was not dramatic. Heavy doors on old hinges, pulled open at a measured pace by the guards posted there. Not loud, not extraordinary. And yet every person in the hall heard it in the same way. The low conversation below the platform slowed, then stopped, in the way sound moved when something entered a space and changed the weight of the air. Serafina kept her eyes on the far wall, but she listened. She heard the footsteps before she saw anything. A single person, walking at an unhurried pace from the back of the hall toward the front. The footsteps were heavy and even, not aggressive, not performing, simply moving through the room with the unself-conscious steadiness of someone who had never needed to consider how they entered a space, because every space had always rearranged itself around them. She lowered her gaze from the wall and looked. The man walking down the center of the hall was not the largest person she had ever seen, but he was the kind of large that felt different from simple size. The kind that had been built by years of real work and real weather and real difficulty. The kind that did not need to announce itself because it was simply and entirely present. He had dark hair worn short, a jaw that looked like it had met more than one hard surface in his life, and had not much minded, and a scar that ran from his left temple to the edge of his cheekbone, pale and old enough to have fully settled. He wore plain, dark traveling clothes with no decoration or insignia. The buyers between him and the front of the hall moved, not because he asked them to, not because he looked at them with any particular intention. They simply moved, the way water moved around something solid, and did not seem to notice they were doing it. The auctioneer's voice had gone slightly uneven. He cleared his throat, then said, with the careful neutrality of someone managing their own visible reaction, "We have a new bidder entering. The current bid on lot 47 stands at..." The man looked up at the platform. He did not look at all 12 people standing on it. He looked at one. He looked at Serafina, and then, with a deliberateness that felt nothing like accident, he looked at her left shoulder. The exact location of the mark. Her heart did something she did not have a name for. She stayed completely still. His gaze moved back to her face. Something was happening behind his eyes. Not an expression she could read, exactly. More like the visible surface of something very large, that was moving very carefully in a very controlled direction. He looked at her the way someone looked when they were holding themselves together with both hands, and had been doing it for a long time. "Name your price," he said. He said it to the auctioneer without looking away from Serafina. The auctioneer's pen hovered. "Current bid is..." "Triple it," the man said. "In gold. Registered today." Dead silence. The woman at the Northridge booth opened her mouth and closed it again. The compound representative from the Eastern Territory did not move at all. Nobody in the hall spoke. The auctioneer looked at his ledger, then at the man, then at his ledger again. The bid is accepted," the auctioneer said. "Lot 47, completed. Ashbourne Pack. Cain Draveth, registered Alpha." Serafina had heard that name before. Everyone had heard that name before. The beast Alpha of Ashbourne, the unmated warlord. The wolf so powerful that even the Alpha Council sent correspondence by messenger rather than risk a direct meeting. He had not been seen outside Ashbourne territory in 7 years. He did not attend exchanges. He did not involve himself in council business. He held the Northern Mountain Territory alone, by force of will and reputation, and he answered to no one. He was looking at her with an expression she still could not fully read, and the mark on her left shoulder was burning warm through her dress like a small sun. Nobody counterbid. Nobody spoke. The auctioneer completed the paperwork with hands that were not entirely steady, and Cain Draveth signed the transfer document without looking down. The whole thing was done in under 5 minutes. When it was finished, he walked to the side of the platform and looked up at her. His voice was even and low, carrying clearly without effort. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then come down." She came down. He fell into step beside her as she walked, not touching her, not directing her, simply present and moving in the same direction. She was very aware of the mark on her shoulder. She was very aware that he had looked at it. She was very aware that she had approximately no information about what that meant. But she had survived 22 years of having no information about things that mattered enormously to her, and she had learned to hold questions without letting them pull her under. She walked out of the exchange hall beside the most feared Alpha on the continent, and focused, very deliberately, on what she could observe. He moved with the kind of ease that belonged to a person who always knew exactly where they were and what was around them. His enforcer team was waiting outside, 4 of them, professional and contained, carrying themselves with the particular alert stillness of people who were always working, even when they appeared to be standing still. One of them held the door of a covered carriage. She got in. The carriage moved. Outside, through the narrow window, she could see the road beginning and the exchange facility falling behind, and she could hear the sound of a horse moving at a steady pace alongside the carriage. Cain Draveth, riding out of the neutral zone toward the north. She pressed her fingers against the mark on her shoulder. It was warmer than it had ever been. The first full day of travel north toward Ashbourne territory was cold and clear, with a pale sky that seemed higher and wider than any sky she had seen from inside the Crescent Vale estate boundaries. She sat in the covered carriage and watched the landscape through the window, the flat transit zone giving way gradually to lower foothills, the foothills beginning to hint at something larger beyond them, a density of terrain that suggested mountains even before she could see them clearly. The enforcer assigned as her primary contact for the journey was a man named Owen. He was perhaps 35, broad across the shoulders, with a quiet and watchful manner that suggested he noticed everything happening around him and expressed almost none of it. He checked on her once in the morning, once after midday, and once in the early evening, appearing at the carriage window each time to ask in a brief and entirely professional way if she needed water, food, or to stop. She asked for water in the morning, and food in the afternoon. Both times he produced them quickly and without comment. She studied him carefully during these brief exchanges, the way she had always studied the people around her, cataloging what was said and what was not said, and what the gap between them implied. Owen was not unfriendly. He was not cold. He was simply someone who moved through his professional responsibilities with the efficiency of a person who valued competence over conversation, and who regarded her, as far as she could tell, with the neutral attention he gave to anything that was his responsibility to manage well. This was, she decided, fine. She did not require warmth from the people around her. She required information, and she was gathering it. The carriage team was a group of 4 enforcers, all of them holding themselves with the same specific and practiced vigilance as Owen. Cain Draveth rode outside, on horseback, ahead of the carriage. She could see him through the front window when the road was straight enough. A figure at the head of the line, upright in the saddle, not hurrying, not lagging. He had not spoken to her since the exchange hall. She had not expected him to. She thought about the look he had given her on the platform. She had replayed it many times over the course of the morning, with the same methodical patience she applied to anything she was trying to understand. He had entered the hall and walked directly to her, not to the auctioneer, not to the platform in general, to her. And then he had looked at her shoulder, at the exact location of the mark, not her face, not her hands, not any of the things most people looked at first, with the deliberateness of someone who was confirming something specific. He knew about the mark. That was the only explanation she had found so far that accounted for all the observable data. Somehow, in a way she did not yet understand, he knew what was on her shoulder, and that knowledge was significant enough to bring the Alpha of Ashbourne to an interpack exchange for the first time in 7 years. She pressed 2 fingers against the mark and felt its warmth, and she thought about the paragraph on page 47 of the old archivist's volume, and she thought about interrupted wolf bonds and emergence crises, and the things that were supposed to be impossible, and she let herself sit with the strangeness of all of it, without trying to resolve it prematurely. The first way station was a modest building at the edge of the transit zone's final stretch before the Ashbourne territorial boundary, stone-built, clean, maintained for exactly this kind of organized travel. They arrived as the light was going gray and gold at the horizon, that particular end-of-day color that made even plain landscapes look briefly significant. Owen arranged rooms with the same efficient brevity he brought to everything. She was given a small room with a window looking north, a wash basin, a narrow bed, and a door that locked from the inside. She set her bag on the floor, washed her face and hands, and sat on the edge of the bed. The day's travel had been quiet, but not unpleasant. The landscape was genuinely interesting to her, broader than anything she had seen in the enclosed geography of Crescent Vale, with a quality of openness that felt less like emptiness and more like space. Real space. The kind that had room for things she could not currently see. She reached up and pulled her collar aside to check the mark. This was an old habit. She did it whenever she was somewhere new or under stress, the way other people might check a familiar object to reassure themselves that something constant was still where they had left it. She tilted her shoulder toward the room's single candle and looked. The mark looked the same as it always had, silver, slightly raised, curved and branching, entirely unchanged. She became aware that the door between her room and the narrow hallway had a gap at the bottom, and that someone was standing in the hallway. She could see the faint interruption of candlelight beneath the door. She did not move. She waited. The person in the hallway was absolutely still for a moment. Then she heard a sharp, quiet breath, the kind of breath a person let out when they had seen something that stopped them entirely. A moment later, retreating footsteps, quick and quiet, moving back down the hall. She let the collar of her dress fall back into place. That had been Owen. She recognized the cadence of his footsteps from the day's travel. She thought about the sharp breath, and the way he had moved immediately away, and the fact that he had not said anything. She thought about what someone with Owen's professional composure would need to see in order to produce that involuntary sound. She sat quietly on the edge of the bed and waited. Perhaps an hour passed. The way station settled around her. The low sounds of the team eating in the common room at the other end of the building. The night outside going fully dark. The kind of quiet that belonged to a place that was in the middle of a long distance between somewhere and somewhere else. Then someone came to her door. The knock was light, not hesitant. There was nothing uncertain about it, but measured, the way a person knocked when they were fully aware of what they were asking and wanted to give the other person the clearest possible opportunity to say no. She crossed to the door. She did not open it. Yes? It's Cain Draveth. A pause. May I see your shoulder? She had not expected the directness. She had expected evasion, or explanation, or preamble. Not that. Not this straightforward, quiet request. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. He was standing in the hallway with one hand resting at his side, and the other holding a small candle that threw his face into a mix of warm light and shadow. He was still wearing the same dark traveling clothes from the day. He looked at her with an expression that was carefully, completely controlled, the surface calm of a great deal of effort. She reached up and pulled her collar aside, turning her shoulder toward the light. The hall went very quiet. She watched his face while he looked at the mark. The controlled expression did not collapse exactly, but something in it moved. Some internal load shifted, the way a wall shifts when something it has been holding against for a very long time is suddenly, carefully, removed. His eyes stayed on the mark. His right hand came up slowly, large, scarred, the hand of a person who had done hard work with it for years, and he reached out toward the edge of the mark. He did not touch her. He stopped with his fingertip about an inch from the outer curve of the design, and she could see that his hand was shaking. Just barely, just at the edge of visible. He said, in a voice that was very low, and very even, and entirely unlike how she imagined a man called the Beast Alpha would sound about anything. It held. She did not know what that meant. She understood, from his expression, and from the shaking of his hand, and from the particular way he said those two words, that it meant something immense. She did not ask him to explain. She had the clear and sudden sense that he would, when he could, and that pushing before he was ready would cost something that she did not want to cost. He lowered his hand. He stepped back from the door. "Sleep," he said. "We'll reach the outer boundary by tomorrow afternoon." He walked back down the hallway without looking back. She closed the door and latched it and stood in the center of the small room for a moment, perfectly still. The mark on her shoulder was the warmest it had ever been. Not painful, not uncomfortable, but present in a way that went past physical, as though something that had been reaching toward a source of warmth for 6 years had finally come close enough to feel it clearly. She sat on the bed. The candle on the table burned steadily. The night outside the window was very dark and very clear, and the sky in the direction of Ashbourne was full of more stars than she had ever seen from the estate in Crescent Vale. She pressed her hand against her shoulder and felt the mark under her palm, warm and bright, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not try to contain what she was feeling. She simply sat with it, with the strangeness and the enormity of it, and the fact that she did not yet understand any of it, but could not quite bring herself to be afraid of it either. He had said it held, as though he had given it something, and had been waiting, without certainty, to find out whether it would survive. She wanted very much to know what that meant. The second day of travel brought the first real sight of the Ashbourne Mountains. They appeared on the horizon mid-morning, and they were nothing like what she had read about them. She had read descriptions, old pack histories with references to the northern range, the Ashbourne ridgelines, the territory that bordered the farthest edge of the settled packlands. The texts had described them as significant, as remote, as a territory that had been held by the Dravith line for 4 generations and had never once been successfully challenged. None of the descriptions had prepared her for the actual visual reality of something that size appearing in a pale winter sky. They were enormous, not in the way of tall buildings or large structures, but in the way of things that had been standing before any of the structures that referenced them existed, and would be standing long after. Dark with old growth at their lower slopes, going to gray stone and then to snow at the heights, with the particular blue-white quality of mountain snow in late winter light. They filled the northern horizon and then some. She watched them through the carriage window for a long time without looking away. She was going to live there. She did not yet know for how long, or in what capacity, or what any of it meant. But she was going to live in the shadow of those mountains, and the mark on her shoulder was warm and steady, and the man who had asked to see it was riding at the head of the line, toward them, with the ease of someone going home. She had the strange, quiet, entirely unprecedented feeling that she was going home too. She had no basis for this feeling. She could not defend it to any reasonable standard of evidence. She held it very carefully, the way she held the paragraph on page 47. And she did not let herself spend it before she understood what it was worth. But she did not put it away, not this time. Ashbourne was not what she had imagined, and she had imagined quite a lot on the journey north. She had expected something like Crescent Vale, a central estate, a defined hierarchy, a territorial headquarters, built in the particular style of a place that wanted to communicate its own importance through its architecture. She had been wrong about all of that. Ashbourne was a mountain settlement in the truest sense, built into the landscape rather than placed on top of it, occupying the wide, sheltered base of a valley between 2 of the lower ridges, with the instinct of a place that had been here long enough to learn exactly which relationships with the land were worth keeping. The buildings were old stone, heavy-walled and low-roofed, connected by covered walkways, and set around a central open space that was less like a courtyard and more like a clearing that had simply decided to stay clear. The whole thing was enormous in scale, and completely uninterested in announcing this. The carriage came to a stop inside the main gate as the afternoon light was going long and gold across the valley floor. Owen had the door open before she had gathered herself to stand. She stepped out and looked up. The mountains rose on 3 sides of the settlement, close enough to be the full context of the sky, and not simply a distant backdrop. The air was colder here than the transit roads, clean and sharp with pine, and the particular mineral quality of high elevation. She could hear water somewhere, a stream, or a small river, moving over stone. She stood in the middle of the Ashbourne main yard, with her bag at her feet and her coat pulled close against the cold, and looked at the mountains. And something in her chest did a thing she did not know how to name. Not fear, not awe exactly, something quieter than both. Owen appeared at her elbow. "Your quarters are ready. I'll take you." She had expected to be shown to a servants' area or a household workroom annex, the kind of space that matched her classification. What Owen showed her to was a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor of the north building, with a sitting room, a sleeping room, a proper washroom with hot water access, and a window that looked directly out at the eastern ridge. She stood in the middle of the sitting room and looked at the furniture, a reading chair by the window, a work table, a shelf of books that had been placed there, she somehow understood, with deliberate intention rather than by coincidence. "There's a library in the east building," Owen said. He held out a small card, heavy paper, embossed with the Ashbourne insignia, and her name written on it in a clean, even hand. "This gives you access. The archivist is usually there in the mornings." She took the card. She turned it over in her hands. "What am I supposed to do here?" she asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Owen looked at her steadily for a moment. "Whatever you need to," he said. "For now, rest. You've had a long few days." He left her there, and she stood in the suite for a while longer, then went to the window and looked at the ridge. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to the rock face, turning it amber, and then rose, and then a deep, luminous purple as the sun went down behind the western mountains. She had never seen anything like it. She had never been somewhere high enough to see anything like it. She unpacked her 3 books and set them on the shelf beside the ones that were already there. She put the knife in the drawer of the work table. She tucked the pressed flower from Peg into the corner of the window frame, where it could catch the morning light. Then she sat in the reading chair, and let herself be still for the first time in days, and she felt the mark on her shoulder humming warm and steady, and she looked out at the mountain and thought about 2 words. It held. She met Lyra the next morning, outside the library building. Lyra was a pack female of about her own age, tall, light-footed, with an easy directness that Serafina found immediately trustworthy because it contained no performance. She was not overly warm in the way of someone trying to manage a visitor's comfort. She was simply present and honest. "You're the one Kane brought back," Lyra said. "Not a question. Not unkind." "Yes," Serafina said. "I'm not going to ask you about it. That's his business, and yours." Lyra tilted her head at the library door. "Are you going in?" "Yes." "Good. The morning light in there is worth having." She was right. The Ashbourne Library was larger than Serafina had expected, and organized with the particular logical care of a collection that had been maintained by someone who genuinely loved the work. She spent 2 hours that first morning simply moving through it, reading spines, pulling volumes to check their contents, building a map of what was there and how it was organized. The archivist had not yet arrived. The second morning, the archivist was there. She was very old, the kind of old that was past a specific age and had simply become a quality, a fundamental characteristic of someone who had seen enough of the world to be entirely unbothered by any new portion of it. Her name was Mara. She had white hair worn up in a loose arrangement that looked accidental but was probably not, and dark, sharp eyes that took in Serafina's presence in the library with neither surprise nor any visible welcoming performance. "You're reading pack history," Mara said, looking at the volume Serafina was holding. "The Western Territorial Records, yes. There's a better source for those in the second alcove. The one you have is a copy, and the copying was careless in 2 of the border dispute chapters." Mara tilted her head toward the back of the room. "Come and sit down. I have some things to tell you." It was not a request. Serafina set down the volume she was holding and followed. Mara settled herself into a chair at a reading table in the quietest corner of the library, and she waited until Serafina was seated across from her, and then she folded her hands on the table and looked at her directly and said, "I've seen the mark on your shoulder. Owen told me what he saw at the way station, and Kane told me the rest, so I know what I'm looking at. The question is what you know." "Very little," Serafina said honestly. Mara nodded. "Then I'll tell you a story, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." "All right." The story Mara told her began 6 years ago, in the dead of a blood moon autumn. A blood moon event was rare, a full moon falling on a night when the atmospheric conditions produced the deep red tint that gave it the name, an occurrence that happened perhaps once every few years, and that had specific effects on wolves undergoing emergence. Emergence crises were not common, but they were a known phenomenon, the wolf soul coming forward before the person was ready for it, or during environmental conditions that made the process unstable. Most of the time they resolved themselves within a day or 2. Sometimes they did not. 6 years ago, Kane Draveth had been on a night patrol of Ashbourne's eastern boundary, alone, which was characteristic of him, according to Mara, when he found a young woman collapsed at the forest line. She was feverish and barely conscious, dressed in the kind of ordinary traveling clothes that belonged to no specific territory. Her wolf was coming forward in crisis, visible in the way her features kept shifting, in the silvering of her eyes, in the low, distressed sound she was making that was half human and half something else. Mara paused here and looked at Serafina carefully. "In an emergence crisis," she said, "a wolf that is coming forward unstably will project. Do you know what that means?" "It reaches for the nearest anchor," Serafina said. She knew this from the medical texts she had read. Another wolf, if the conditions allow it. Something to stabilize against. Yes. Mara folded her hands a little more tightly. Her wolf was projecting, and it reached for Kane's wolf, before either of them had any chance to prevent it. The bond impulse fired, the first stage connection, the one that begins a mate claim, and Kane had to make a choice, in about 5 seconds, with no information except what was happening in front of him. Serafina said nothing. She was very still. "He answered the call," Mara said. He gave the first mark, the initial bond seal, pressed into her shoulder to give her wolf an anchor and pull her back from the crisis edge. It is not supposed to be done with a stranger. It is not supposed to be done without consent or ceremony or the long-standing connection that is supposed to precede it. He knew all of that, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was letting her wolf tear itself apart in a crisis, and killing her in the process. The sitting room of the library was very quiet. It worked, Mara said. The crisis stabilized. She started to come back from the fever. Kane sat with her through the night. By morning, the worst was past. She paused. When the fever fully broke, he went to get water. He was gone perhaps 10 minutes. When he came back, she was gone. There was no trace, no scent trail, nothing. Whatever had happened during the blood moon, it had removed any evidence of her passage. He searched the boundary for 2 days. He found nothing. Mara unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. He has been looking for 6 years, she said quietly. He gave a bond mark to a stranger to save her life, with no way to find her afterward, and no certainty she had even survived. The mark he gave would have appeared on her shoulder. If her wolf had accepted the anchor, if the bond had taken at all, the mark would be there. If it hadn't taken, she would have no mark, and he would have no way to find her, and the bond impulse would have been a one-sided thing that simply faded. She looked at Serafina. He thought, for most of 6 years, that it hadn't taken. Serafina's voice, when she found it, was very quiet. What made him think otherwise? He told me, Mara said slowly, that he had a feeling. Nothing more specific than that. A feeling, about a month before the exchange notice went out, that something had changed somewhere, that the mark he had given was still active, that it had, somewhere, held. It held. The 2 words from the hallway of the way station landed in Serafina's chest, with the physical weight of something falling into place from a very long height. She was sitting very still, with her hand pressed flat against her left shoulder, and the mark under her palm was burning warm in a way that was entirely different from its usual background hum, alive with the specific intensity of something that had been reaching in one direction for 6 years and could now feel the distance narrowing. I have had this mark, she said, since the morning after my 16th birthday. Mara looked at her. I have never been able to explain it, Serafina continued. No wolf, no emergence, no mate. Just the mark, appearing overnight, with no origin anyone could identify. She stopped for a moment. My 16th birthday was 6 years ago. It was a blood moon autumn. The silence in the library was the most complete silence she had ever heard. She did not remember the night clearly. She had always attributed the gaps in her memory of that period to the distress of the failed emergence, the 2 weeks of examinations, the shock of the news, the reorganization of everything she had expected her life to be. But there was one specific memory she had always carried and never quite accounted for. Waking on the morning of her birthday, with the mark already there, and no clear memory of the hours after sunset the night before. A dream of cold stone under her hands, a sense of heat, a voice she could not now reconstruct. She pressed her hand harder against her shoulder. She had been the girl in the forest. She had collapsed at an Ashbourne boundary line 6 years ago, in an emergence crisis during a blood moon night. Cain Draveth had found her. He had given her the mark that had been on her shoulder every single day since, the mark she had spent 6 years researching without finding an origin, the mark that hummed with warmth and connection to something she could not identify because the connection led to a person she had never knowingly met. Does he know? She asked. He suspected, Mara said. He confirmed it when he saw the mark on the platform. She paused. He has been carrying this for 6 years. The knowledge that he did something irreversible to a person he could not find. The uncertainty of whether you were alive. Of whether the mark had been accepted at all. He did not buy you from that exchange because he owns you, Serafina. He bought you because you were the only one in the room he had been looking for since he was 28 years old, and he was not going to let you disappear into a placement assignment in the Eastern Territories. Serafina sat with this for a long time. The mark on her shoulder was warm and insistent and felt, now that she knew what it was, nothing like a mystery. It felt like an answer. I would like to speak to him, she said, when I'm ready. Of course, Mara said. Not today. Of course not, Mara said gently. Take the time you need. The examination happened on the 3rd morning. Serafina had not slept. She had spent the night sitting in the chair by the window, watching the eastern ridge go from black to gray, to the first pale colors of dawn, and she had done what she did with all the largest pieces of information she had ever received. She had taken them apart very carefully, examined every component, and put them back together in the order that made the most sense. What she had was this. She had been in an emergence crisis 6 years ago. She had no memory of it. She had a bond mark on her shoulder from that night. She had spent 6 years classified as having no wolf, a classification that no one in her life had questioned, because the pack physician had confirmed it, and her father had enforced it, and everyone else had simply accepted it as fact. But there was one piece of this that did not fit neatly, and she had been sitting with it through the night, turning it over and over. Bonding marks appeared when a wolf bond was accepted, not when one was given. Given and accepted were two different things, and the texts were clear on this. A mark pressed into the shoulder of an unconscious wolfless person should have faded within hours of being given, because there was no wolf on the receiving end to accept and hold the connection. The mark would not have survived. Her mark had survived 6 years, which meant her wolf had accepted the bond, which meant her wolf existed. She was standing at the library entrance when Dr. Fenra arrived for her shift, and she asked, in the direct and specific way she asked everything, "I need a full medical examination. As thorough as you can make it. Not a health check. A full assessment, specifically for wolf suppression." Dr. Fenra was a woman of about 45, with the calm precision of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by unusual presentations. She looked at Serafina for a moment with an assessing quality that was entirely professional. "Kane asked me to make myself available to you. Come with me." The examination room in the Ashbourne Medical Building was clean and well-equipped. Dr. Fenra worked methodically, checking the things that standard health assessments checked, and then going further, running the secondary assessments that detected wolf suppression rather than wolf absence, which were different tests with different markers, tests that most pack physicians did not run by default, because wolf suppression in a normal healthy adult was not a common enough condition to be part of standard protocol. She was 40 minutes into the examination when she stopped. She set down the instrument she was using. She turned to look at Serafina, with an expression that was carefully controlled but not fully controlled, something underneath it that was moving in a direction Serafina could not quite predict. "When did your symptoms first appear?" Dr. Fenra asked. "The ones that were interpreted as hollow emergence." "At 16, Serafina said. "The morning after my birthday." "Not before?" "Not before." Dr. Fenra was quiet for a long moment. "Are you aware," she said, very carefully, "that there is a class of pharmaceutical compound, not commonly used, not legally available through standard pack medical suppliers, that produces a sustained suppression of wolf activity, specifically the wolf's presence signals, the scent profile, the behavioral indicators, the secondary development that occurs after emergence?" Serafina's breathing stayed even. "I am aware of this class," she said. "I read about it in a medical reference text 3 years ago. It's used for dangerous wolves in high-security containment situations." "Yes." Dr. Fenra held her gaze. "Your blood work shows sustained compound markers consistent with long-term use of that class of suppressant. Not a single dose. Not a short course. A graduated, maintained administration over approximately 6 years, starting at or near the time of your 16th birthday. Your wolf has been chemically suppressed since approximately the morning of your emergence. Someone has been administering this to you consistently, for 6 years, in doses carefully calibrated to maintain suppression without producing obvious side effects. The compound's main action is to muffle the wolf's presence signals entirely, scent profile, behavioral indicators, and any external evidence that a wolf soul exists." Serafina sat on the edge of the examination table and looked at her hands. "Your wolf accepted the bond mark 6 years ago," Dr. Fenra continued quietly. "That's why the mark held. But the wolf was then immediately, within days, placed under chemical suppression so complete that even a trained pack physician, performing a standard examination, would find no evidence of wolf presence. Because there was no evidence. The compound hides everything." "My father," Serafina said. Dr. Fenra said nothing. "He found the mark," Serafina said. She was not asking. She was reconstructing, out loud, the sequence of events she should have been able to reconstruct years ago, if she had had access to the right information. "He found the mark the morning after my birthday." He did not know what it meant, but he understood that it was a bond mark, and that a bond mark on his daughter meant another alpha had a claim on her. He did not go to the Alpha Council. He did not investigate. He went to a back-market physician, and he arranged for the suppression to begin. Her voice was entirely level. She was aware of this, and chose not to change it, because she needed to finish the reconstruction before she could afford to feel any of what was underneath it. A broken daughter was shameful, she said. A daughter secretly bond-marked by an unknown alpha was dangerous. The suppression solved both problems. It erased the wolf, which erased any evidence that the mark had been received, which meant the mark itself became unexplainable. A strange anomaly that he could instruct everyone not to discuss, and I spent 6 years believing I had no wolf. She stopped. Dr. Fenra waited. How long, Serafina asked, will it take for the compound to clear my system? That depends on how you want to proceed, Dr. Fenra said carefully. Stopping the administration immediately and allowing natural clearance takes significantly longer than an active withdrawal protocol. The withdrawal protocol is faster, but it will be difficult. Your wolf has been suppressed for 6 years. When the compound leaves your system, your wolf will wake up very disoriented and in considerable distress. The process will be physically demanding. And at the end of it? At the end of it, you will have a fully functioning wolf, complete scent profile, complete shift capability, everything that was suppressed, restored. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, When do we start? Dr. Fenra looked at her for another moment. Then she said, quietly, and with something in her voice that was not quite pity, and was not quite admiration, but existed somewhere between the two, I'll prepare the protocol tonight. Day 1 of the withdrawal was uncomfortable. Her skin felt too warm. Her bones ached in a low, persistent way, the way they did before a serious fever set in. She could not get comfortable in any position for longer than a few minutes, and the air in the suite felt wrong in a way she could not specify, too thick or too thin, varying without warning. She read through most of the first day, sitting in the chair by the window and working through the Ashbourne pack history that Mara had given her. She slept badly that night, fitfully, in short segments, waking repeatedly with the sensation of something pressing against the edges of her awareness from the inside. Day 2 was significantly worse. The discomfort became pain, not sharp, not localized, but general, and bone-deep and relentless. The fever arrived by midday, building steadily through the afternoon. Dr. Fenra came 3 times. She checked Serafina's condition, adjusted the withdrawal protocol slightly, left remedies for the fever, and said with the same careful steadiness she brought to everything that this was expected and that it would not last forever. Serafina believed her and found it was only moderately helpful, because believing something intellectually and living inside it physically were 2 different kinds of experience. She kept thinking, during the long bad hours of day 2, about the 6 years. Not with grief exactly. She had done the work on this, the quiet internal accounting, and she had arrived at a place that felt more like cold recognition than grief, but with the particular weight of understanding just how much had been taken from her by a choice that had never been hers to make. 6 years of believing she was broken. 6 years of accepting the social cost of that belief, the marginal existence, the stone-walled room, the lot 47 on the bracelet, all of it built on a lie that her own father had chosen over the alternative of protecting her. She was not going to spend energy on this. Not right now. She would put it in the place where the large, necessary things went, where the page 47 footnote had lived, where the 2 words from the hallway had lived, and she would deal with it when she had the physical capacity to do so properly. Right now, her job was to get through this. Day 3 was the worst. The fever peaked sometime in the early hours of the morning, and stayed. She was aware of Dr. Fenra's presence in the room, of the cool cloth that appeared at intervals on her forehead, of the low, careful voices of people monitoring something that was progressing as expected, but was still difficult to watch. She was not entirely conscious of all of it. She drifted in and out, and when she was out, she was in the strange layered territory between sleep and fever dream, where everything was more vivid than waking, and made no narrative sense. Her wolf was there, in the dreams. She could feel it, not see it, not communicate with it, but feel its presence, the way you felt a large animal in a dark room, the specific sense of something breathing, and alive, and contained. It was not calm. It was furious, actually, the particular fury of something that had been trapped in the dark for a very long time, and could finally feel the walls thinning. And the fury was not directed at her. She understood, in the dream logic of the fever, that the fury was directed at the walls themselves. She was aware, At some point on day 3, or possibly early day 4, she had lost track of the boundary, that there was someone outside her suite door. She could hear, when the fever gave her a moment of relative clarity, the presence of a person in the hallway. Not movement, not sound exactly, just the quality of the air that changed when a space had someone in it who was paying attention to what was on the other side of a closed door. When Owen appeared briefly with water, she asked him, "Who was outside?" Owen did not hesitate. "Kane," he said. "He's been there since yesterday afternoon." She lay with this for a while. On day 4, during a stretch of relative clarity in the late afternoon, she said, loudly enough to reach the door, "Come in." There was a pause, then the door opened and Kane Draveth came in and sat in the chair across the room from her bed, with the ease of someone who had waited a long time to be given permission to enter a room, and was not going to make anything of receiving it now. He did not look at her, Wolf. He did not look at the mark. He looked at her face, briefly and directly, and then he looked at the window and he began to talk. He talked about the mountains. He described the eastern ridge at dawn, the specific way the light hit the granite face, the color the snow took in the first half hour of morning, the way the sound of the stream below the valley changed in spring when the snowmelt volume increased. He described the old-growth forest on the northern slope, how old some of the trees were, what the floor of that forest smelled like in late autumn, the specific kind of quiet that existed inside it that did not exist anywhere else in the territory he had ever found. His voice was low and even, and entirely unhurried. He was not trying to comfort her. He was not performing calm for her benefit. He was simply talking, the way a person talked about something they knew well and valued genuinely, and the sound of it was steady, in the way that the mark on her shoulder was steady, consistent, and present, and asking nothing of her. She fell asleep somewhere in the description of the North Slope deer paths that the pack used in summer. When she woke, the room was dim with evening light. He was still there. He looked up from the window when he heard her stir. "The fever's coming down," he said. "I know," she said. She could feel it. Not gone, but reduced. The edges of her consciousness were cleaner than they had been. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Since this afternoon," he said. "You asked me in. I stayed." She thought about this. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did 6 years ago. I understand now what you were trying to do." Something moved across his face, not the controlled surface expression she had seen before. Something underneath it, briefly visible. "You should rest," he said. "I know," she said again, and she closed her eyes, and she let herself rest. Day 5 was rough again. Not as bad as day 3, but with the particular exhausted difficulty of something that had been hard for a long time, and was not quite finished. He came in when she asked. She did not ask him to talk about the mountains this time. She asked him questions instead. She asked about the pack structure of Ashbourne, how many members, how the enforcer system worked, what the trade relationships with the surrounding territories looked like. He answered everything in the same direct and specific way he talked about everything, without deflection and without performance. She asked about his decision to come to the exchange, and he said, "I had a feeling that something had changed. I followed it." "That was a significant action to take on a feeling," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was. Were you afraid you were wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." She looked at the ceiling. "I didn't know," she said. "About the crisis. About that night. I woke up the next morning with the mark, and no memory of the hours before. 6 years of thinking I was broken when my wolf was simply waiting." "Not broken," he said. His voice was very flat on those 2 words, in a way that communicated more than any elaboration would have. "Not for a day." Day 6. She woke with no fever. She opened her eyes. The room was morning gray and very quiet. She lay still and took stock of herself the way she did after any long illness, checking each part of her internal landscape for damage or improvement, moving methodically from the familiar to the unfamiliar. It was there. She felt it the way she imagined you felt, a second heartbeat, if such a thing were possible. A presence inside her own awareness that was entirely other than her, and entirely belonging to her at the same time. Warm and silver and ancient, her wolf, settling into wakefulness after 6 years of enforced sleep, moving with the careful, deliberate quality of something that was still determining how much space it was allowed to take. She sat up. She breathed. She looked at the room around her in the early light, and the room looked back at her with the ordinary solidity of a real place, but everything in it was more specific than before. The texture of the blanket, the grain of the wood in the chair by the window, the particular cold pine quality of the morning air coming through the gap at the window frame. She could smell everything: the mountain, the stone of the building, the fire that had burned in the hallway through the night, the lingering trace of Dr. Fenra's visits, the herbal preparation she used, the specific clean scent of someone whose wolf was very old and had been well cared for. And underneath all of it, underneath everything else in the room and the building and the morning, she could smell him. She did not need to have ever been told who this scent belonged to. Her wolf knew. The mark on her shoulder knew. She knew. Something in her chest pulled like a tide pulled by a distant moon, not painfully, not urgently, but inevitably. The mark on her shoulder was no longer humming. It was glowing, warm and steady and complete, as though something that had been only partly lit for 6 years had finally been given enough current to shine properly. She sat in the Ashbourne morning and breathed, and felt her wolf breathe with her, and understood, for the first time in her life, what it meant to be whole. 8 days after the fever broke, she was well enough to go outside. Lyra came for her after breakfast, in the same easy, unpresumptuous way Lyra did most things. "The eastern yard is quiet this time of morning," she said, "if you want to walk." The eastern yard was a broad, stone-paved space on the far side of the library building, looking out at the ridge. The morning was clear and sharply cold, the kind of cold that felt clean rather than punishing, and the air carried all the information the mountain had to offer: pine, rock, snow at the heights, the particular crispness of high elevation in winter. Serafina walked the perimeter of the yard slowly, still rebuilding her physical strength after the withdrawal, and she let her wolf orient itself to the new environment. The wolf was quieter now than it had been in the fever dreams, still alert, still processing, but no longer furious. It was taking in the territory around them with the same careful attention Serafina brought to a new place, and she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that she and her wolf operated in very similar ways. She had not expected to like her wolf so immediately. She had expected something more complicated, given the circumstances of its arrival. Owen found her in the eastern yard just before midday. He appeared at the yard entrance with the careful, professional manner he brought to most things, and he said, "I need to tell you about some developments. Kane wants you to know directly, not secondhand." She stopped walking. "Tell me." The exchange kept detailed records of every transaction. That was standard practice, and had always been. It was what made the exchange legally functional across pact territories, with different laws and different customs. The records showed that the Ashbourne Alpha had personally attended and purchased a single female classified as hollow emergence. Records like this did not stay private for long. Word had traveled. 2 parties had contacted Ashbourne within the same week, both requesting formal entry to the territory for a meeting. The first was Gerald Voss, who had arrived at the outer boundary with a PAC-licensed contract mediator, and was currently being held at the way station pending her response. His stated position was that the exchange sale had been made under a misregistration, that his daughter's true condition had been unknown to him at the time of the transaction, and he was claiming breach of family compact and requesting a review of the terms. The second was a representative from the Alpha Council, a man named Councillor Braden, who had traveled with 2 advisors, and was making his position clear through Owen, as an intermediary, even before arriving within the settlement gates. His position was this: a bond mark, given 6 years ago to an unconscious female, without formal ceremony, without established prior bond relationship, without recorded consent, existed in a gray zone under the interpact common law. The council wished to take responsibility for adjudicating the validity of this bond. If Serafina formally denied the bond in a witnessed, documented statement before the council's appointed deadline, the matter would be closed, and she would be placed under the council's own protective custody. If she did not formally deny it, the council would move to nullify it on grounds of non-consensual marking, and claim guardianship of her themselves. They had framed this, Owen said, as being done in her best interest. Serafina stood in the eastern yard, and looked at the ridge for a moment, and thought about what the Alpha Council's interest in her best interests would have looked like 6 years ago, and 8 years ago, and every year of her life, when the person who might benefit from their attention was simply a wolfless girl in a servant's wing, and not someone whose situation gave the council leverage over an alpha who had never answered to them. "Where is Kane?" she said. "The war room. He wanted you to see me first, so you'd hear it from someone without a stake in your decision." "That was considerate of him," she said. "Take me to the war room." The war room was a long, low-ceilinged space in the western building, lined with territorial maps and the kind of working furniture that was clearly used for actual work rather than for impressing visitors. Kane was at the main table, standing rather than sitting, with Edric, his senior enforcer, a compact, stone-faced man in his 40s, and Mara, who was looking at everything with the particular sharp attention of someone who had seen enough political situations to be annoyed by this one. Kane looked up when she came in. He looked at her in the direct, uncomplicated way he looked at everything, not managing her, not trying to read how she was taking it, just looking. She took the chair at the end of the table. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Whatever you choose," he said. "I will not fight you on it." She looked at him. "Do you mean that?" "I mean it." She had spent 6 years developing a very specific capacity for determining whether a person meant what they said or was performing meaning, while privately expecting a different outcome. She looked at Kane Dravith, this enormous, scarred, reportedly terrifying alpha who had sat outside her door for 4 days without being asked, and had talked about deer paths and snowmelt and the quality of quiet in an old forest, and she believed him. "I want to sleep on it," she said. "Can you hold them at the boundary until morning?" "Yes," he said. "Then I need 1 night." She went back to her suite. She sat in the window with the eastern ridge in front of her, and the mark warm on her shoulder, and she spent the night doing what she did with everything that mattered. She took it apart carefully, examined every component, and put it back together in the order that made the most sense. Gerald was going to say he had not known. He had known. There was not a version of this story in which a man who had arranged 6 years of pharmaceutical suppression for his daughter had not known. He was going to say it anyway, and he was going to have prepared paperwork to support the claim, and none of it was going to be true. The Alpha Council was going to say they were protecting her. They were not protecting her. They had never been protecting her. They were protecting their own interest in having leverage over Ashbourne, wrapped in the language of concern for a person they had shown no interest in at any point during her actual life. Both of these were facts. She held them clearly and without heat. She held other facts too. The library pass, the suite of rooms, with the reading chair and the window facing the ridge, and the shelf of books placed there by someone with enough attention to notice what she was. The 6 days of fever, during which Kane Dravith had sat in the hallway outside her door, without asking anything of her. The conversations about mountains, not attempts to impress her, or to establish his importance, just the genuine offering of someone who knew a place well, and wanted to share what they knew, because the person on the other side of the wall needed something steady to hold on to. The way he had said, in the war room this afternoon, that he would not fight her choice, and the way she had looked at him when he said it, and had found nothing behind it, except exactly what it said. These were also facts. In the morning, she asked Owen to arrange the meeting. She dressed carefully that morning, not ceremonially. She had no interest in performing the significance of what she was about to do. But she chose the clothes she put on with deliberate attention, because how a person stood in a difficult room mattered, and she had been standing in difficult rooms her entire life, and knew exactly what she needed from her own posture and presentation to get through one cleanly. The meeting room that Owen arranged was a long, formal space in the central building, larger than she would have chosen, but appropriate for the number of people who needed to be present. Councillor Braden and his 2 advisors sat to one side of the main table. Gerald and his contract mediator sat on the other. Kane's inner circle, Owen, Edric, Dr. Fenra, Mara, stood along the rear wall. The Ashbourne pack elders, 3 of them, occupied chairs at the room's far end. Kane himself stood near the rear, against the wall, not at the table. She sat in the chair at the center of the table. Not at the head of it, not at one of the sides, but directly in the middle, where the people on both sides of the argument would have to look at her directly to address her. Councillor Braden was a compact man, with the particular kind of authority that came from an institution rather than from any quality of his own. He stated his position formally and with practiced confidence, the legal framework, the timeline, the offer of council guardianship, the implication that this was a generous arrangement that she should be grateful to receive. He did not say she should be grateful. but it was very present in the way he said everything else. Gerald went next. He looked, she noticed, considerably older than the last time she had seen him in that corridor. His mediator had clearly briefed him carefully. He used words like unknown circumstances, and unintended misrepresentation, and emotional complexity, with the smooth delivery of someone who had rehearsed them. He did not look at her directly. He had not looked at her directly in 6 years. When Gerald's mediator indicated he had finished his statement, the room turned to her. Serafina stood up. She was not going to hurry this. She was not going to raise her voice. She was not going to perform either distress or dignity, because she did not need to perform either thing. She was in possession of both of them naturally, and she was going to simply, clearly, and completely speak the truth. "I'll start with facts," she said. "Not my feelings about them, the facts. I was classified as having no wolf from the age of 16. That classification, as Dr. Fenra has documented in a full examination of my blood work, was the result of a sustained pharmaceutical suppression, administered to me over 6 years, using a back-market compound not available through legitimate pack medical suppliers. This compound was designed to suppress wolf presence signals so completely that even a trained pack physician would find no evidence of wolf activity on standard examination. My father had access to this compound. My father had both motive and opportunity to begin this suppression at the exact time it began. These are facts, and I would like them stated clearly and in front of everyone in this room." Gerald had gone completely still. She turned to Braden. "Counselor, the council's concern for my well-being is noted. I also note that this concern appeared at a specific time, when my situation became relevant to the Alpha Council's relationship with the Ashbourne territory. It was not present when I was a wolfless girl doing kitchen work in a servant's wing. It was not present when I was catalogued as Lot 47 and sold from an exchange platform. It was not present at any point during the 22 years of my actual life before this moment. I note this not with bitterness but because it is a fact that belongs in the room." Braden opened his mouth. She did not pause. "I am not denying the bond," she said. "I want that stated clearly. I am not denying it on the grounds of what the law requires, or what my wolf wants, or what would be convenient for anyone in this room." She paused. "I am not accepting it on those grounds either." The room was completely quiet. "I am accepting it," she said, "on the following grounds. A library pass given to a person who had not been allowed to read freely in years. A suite of rooms, not a servant's corner. 6 days of fever, during which the Alpha of Ashbourne sat outside my door, without asking anything of me, and when I asked him in, talked to me about mountains. Not about bonds or law or obligations, about mountains. The specific way a person talks about something they love and want to share." She stopped for a moment, and the fact that when I asked him what he wanted to happen, he said whatever I chose, he would not fight me on it. I believe him. These are the grounds I am choosing. She looked at the elders at the far end of the room. "I am formally registering my intent to pursue the mate bond under the 6-month courtship provision of the common law. That is my legal right, and I am exercising it now, in front of witnesses, as my own free choice, made in full possession of my faculties, and with complete understanding of the implications." She looked at Gerald. "You should go now." She looked at Braden. "You as well." Neither of them spoke. Gerald's mediator gathered the papers on the table in front of him, without meeting anyone's eyes. Braden exchanged a brief look with his advisors that communicated nothing useful to anyone watching. The room cleared with the particular quiet efficiency of people who understood that they had been outmaneuvered and were choosing to leave with what remained of their composure. When the door closed behind the last of them, the room contained only the Ashbourne people. Mara was looking at her with the expression of someone watching something they had been waiting to see for a long time. Dr. Fenra had her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin up. Owen was impassive, which on Owen communicated considerable internal approval. Edric had the look of a person making a careful reassessment of something they had previously underestimated. Kane walked from the back wall to where she was standing. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with that direct, uncomplicated look. 6 months is a long time, he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not in a hurry. Are you?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The edge of one. She felt something move at the corner of her mouth in return. "No," he said. "I have been waiting 6 years. 6 months is nothing." They stood there in the cleared meeting room, with the mountain light coming through the high windows, and neither of them spoke again for a moment. and it was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who had just made an agreement that was going to take time and honesty and work, and who both understood this, and who were both, in their own specific and characteristic ways, entirely willing to do all three. The first full month of the courtship window was not easy, and Serafina had not expected it to be. Her wolf was still orienting to the world. 6 years of suppression did not simply reverse in 8 days of withdrawal and leave a person with a fully settled, well-adjusted animal soul. Her wolf was present and functional and completely hers. She had established this quickly, with relief, but it was also still cautious in the way of something that had been burned before and had not yet fully integrated the knowledge that the burning was over. It processed new environments carefully. It took time with new people. It watched everything before it committed to anything. This was, Serafina noted privately, not entirely unlike how she herself operated. Perhaps this was not a coincidence. She began running in wolf form with Lyra and a small group from the pack at the end of the first week. Carefully, at first, because the physical reality of the shift was still new, and her body needed time to find its way through it cleanly. The first full run on the mountain's lower slope, on a morning so cold and clear it made everything look freshly made, was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her life. Speed that belonged entirely to her own body. The forest floor coming up under her paws, rock and snow and old pine needles, and the particular intelligence of terrain that could be read through the shift in a completely different way than it could be read on 2 feet. The scent of the mountain in every direction, alive and complex and specific, in ways that built a map of the world in a form she had never had access to before. The pack running alongside her, Lyra a lighter shape to her left, 2 others she had met briefly in the past weeks moving in easy formation, and the particular awareness of not being alone in a physical space, the wolf-deep recognition of shared territory and shared direction. She came back from the first full run, breathless and shaking, and with her heart so full of something she had no name for, that she had to stop at the yard gate and just stand for a moment, with her wolf settling warm inside her chest and the pine air cold on her face, and be still. Lyra stopped beside her. She did not say anything. She simply stood there. "Thank you," Serafina said eventually. "You're welcome," Lyra said. The relationship with Cain built in the weeks that followed, the way all genuine things built. Slowly, by accumulation, through the small specific actions that revealed character more reliably than any declaration. She learned how he communicated. He was not a man who used many words, and the ones he used were always precise. He did not say things he did not mean, and he did not mean things he did not say, which made him, she found, one of the more straightforward people she had ever tried to understand. What required patience was learning to read the things he expressed through action rather than language, which were many. He appeared at her wolf form training sessions 3 times in the first month, sitting quietly at the edge of the practice area, and each time he left without comment when it was finished. She understood eventually that this was his version of showing support without imposing it, and she found she appreciated the distinction. She had difficulties of her own, and she knew it. The shame that she had lived inside for 22 years did not simply leave because she had stood up in front of a room and stated a series of facts. It lived in the deeper structure of how she moved through spaces, and how she responded to unexpected kindness, and what happened in her chest when something good occurred, and her first involuntary reaction was to wait for it to be taken back. She worked on this. She was not good at asking for help with it, but she was honest when Cain noticed it, and he noticed it more often than she expected. In the second month, in an evening conversation that had started as a discussion about pack law and had become something else, she said something that was partly unfair and partly an accurate identification of a real problem, and he did not respond well to the unfair part. He went very still in the way he went still when he was managing something difficult, and she mistook the stillness for withdrawal, and the misunderstanding compounded. They had, in effect, their first real argument. Not a loud one. Neither of them was particularly loud, but it had the sharp quality of 2 people who were being honest with each other for the first time about something that actually mattered, and it left the evening with unresolved weight. She went to his office the next morning. She had thought carefully about what to say, and had arrived at a formulation she thought was both honest and fair. He was already there when she came in. He looked up, he said, before she could speak. "I handled that poorly last night. I know what you were actually trying to tell me. and I responded to the part that was easy to respond to, instead of the part that was real. She stopped in the doorway. I said something that was partly unfair, she said. I was directing at you a frustration that wasn't entirely about you. I know, he said. I'm still learning how to read where one ends and the other begins. So am I, she said. They looked at each other for a moment. I'm not going to get this right every time, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not either, she said. I also want to be clear about that. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk, and they talked through the actual difficulty, the real one, the one that mattered. It took longer and was harder than the conversation the night before, and it was significantly more useful. In the third month, she asked Owen if she could join the next territory patrol. She had been reading the boundary maps in the library and had some questions that required being in the field rather than at a table, and she said so directly. Owen looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Kane already approved it. She had not asked Kane. When? Last week. He told me that if you asked, the answer was yes. Owen's expression was as professionally neutral as ever, which was itself a kind of communication. He anticipated you'd ask within the month. She went on the patrol. She came back with scratched boots from the eastern terrain, specific opinions about 3 of the boundary markers that she thought were positioned poorly based on the sight lines, and a considerably more detailed mental map of the territory she was, quietly and officially, beginning to think of as her own. She told Kane about the boundary markers at dinner that evening with the specific, direct authority of someone who had done the assessment herself and had the data to support it. He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, You're right about the northeastern one. We've been arguing about it for 2 years. She told him which reposition she would suggest and why. He sent Owen to look at it the next morning. She began working in the library with Mara in the 4th month, taking over the organization of the Eastern Archive records that had been neglected for some years, because Mara's other responsibilities did not leave time for them. The work was exactly suited to her particular combination of skills: systematic thinking, patience with detail, broad contextual knowledge, and the ability to recognize what was significant within a large body of information. She found herself useful in a way she had never been useful before, not because she was performing a function that was assigned to her position, but because she was applying what she actually was to something that genuinely needed it. She told Mara this once, briefly, on a morning when the realization had come to her with particular clarity. Mara looked at her over the records they were sorting and said, Yes, that's how it's supposed to work. I didn't know, Serafina said. I know you didn't, Mara said. Now you do. The 5th month brought the first warm day of the year, a morning in early spring, when the light had a different quality to it, softer and more gold, with the particular warmth that meant the mountain was beginning to shift into a new season. She asked Kane to take her to the north ridge he had described during the fever nights, the ridge where the snow stayed latest, the old forest below it, the specific quiet he had told her about. He took her. They went up in the morning and were there for 6 hours. The north slope was exactly as he had described it, old, dense, with a floor so soft with years of accumulated needles that their footsteps were absorbed into it without sound. The quiet was the kind that had its own texture, not emptiness, but fullness, the specific fullness of a place that contained a great deal of life, operating below the threshold of human noise. She stood in the middle of it, and breathed in, and thought, I would have lived and died in a servant's wing, and never been anywhere that felt like this. They walked back down in the late afternoon, at a place where the path narrowed between 2 old trees before opening onto the lower slope. He reached out and took her hand briefly. Not romantic performance, not a statement, just a hand, offered in the natural way of 2 people walking a narrow path who were paying attention to each other. She took it, she held it until the path widened, she let go when it made sense to let go. Neither of them made anything of it. It was exactly what it was, and they both knew what it was, and that was enough. In the 6th month, she had a nightmare. She was back on the platform in the exchange hall. The cold light, the stone smell, the buyers below arranged in their practical order. The auctioneer's voice reading her classification. Lot 47. Female. Hollow emergence. No wolf confirmed. No scent profile. the metal bracelet on her wrist with the number stamped into it. The slow, careful bids accumulating while people decided if she was worth the minimum rate. She woke with her heart beating too fast, and her wolf immediately awake and present, oriented toward her distress, in the focused way her wolf oriented toward anything that was a problem to be addressed. She sat up. She breathed through it. She thought about the fact that she was in a room with a window facing the eastern ridge, and a library pass on the bedside table, and a wolf settled in her chest like a second heartbeat, and she let the reality of her actual situation reassert itself over the reality of the dream. In the morning she told Kane about it. She did not have a specific reason for telling him, except that she had spent 22 years not being able to tell anyone anything, and she was choosing, deliberately, to change that. He sat across from her at the breakfast table, and he listened to all of it. The platform, the number, the slow bids, the metal bracelet, the look on her father's face when he signed the documents, without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know you don't need me to fix it. I just want you to know that I know it happened. All of it." She looked at him. "That's the right thing to say. I've been practicing," he said. She laughed. A real laugh. The full, unguarded kind, and it surprised her slightly, because it came so naturally, and because the surprise itself was pleasant rather than alarming, which was its own kind of information about how much had changed. He was watching her laugh with the expression she had slowly, over 6 months, learned to read as the thing he felt but did not perform, something warm and steady and very real. 3 days, he said. She knew what he meant. The 6-month window closed in 3 days. 3 days, she agreed. The night of the full moon, at the end of the 6th month, was clear and cold and absolutely still. The kind of night the mountains made when they were not doing anything but being themselves. No wind, no weather, just the great quiet of a high-altitude winter sky crowded with stars. She and Kane went to the mountain overlook on foot, through the lower slope forest, following a path she now knew well enough to walk in the dark. The overlook was a flat rock shelf partway up the eastern face that jutted out over the valley below, the place where, on her 4th full day at Ashbourne, he had shown her the full spread of the territory for the first time, with the specific quiet pride of a person showing someone something they loved. They stood on the rock shelf, with the valley below them and the full moon above, and the mark on her shoulder was warm, in the way it had been warm for 6 months. Present and real and reaching toward its completion, patient in the way that it had always been patient, as though it had never doubted that this moment would arrive. The bond completion was not dramatic. She had read about it and understood what to expect. The second mark, given and received this time with full knowledge and full choice, the bond seal completing the connection that the first mark had opened 6 years ago. She gave him the second mark. He completed her first, and when it was done, the thing that settled between them was not a change, but a deepening of what had been building across 6 months and 6 years, and, in some form she did not have language for, longer than either. It did not feel like chains. She had been afraid, once, that it might. She was not afraid anymore. It felt like the door she had stood outside of for 22 years, the door to a room that had her name on it, the room she had always been told did not exist, opening. Warm, wide, entirely hers. She stood on the overlook with the valley below and the mountain above, and her wolf settled deep and certain in her chest. And she thought about the morning at the distribution table, when Helene had told her the Voss household standing was under review. She thought about the metal bracelet with the number 47 stamped into it. She thought about the stone platform, and the cold light, and the auctioneer's professional voice saying no wolf confirmed, no scent profile, and she thought about what she had believed in that moment, that she was broken, that she was nothing, that the sum total of what she had to offer the world was whatever someone at a minimum bid was willing to accept. She thought about Peg, who had stood beside her at a counter and said cold morning, in the way a person said it to another person. She thought about a paragraph on page 47 of a dusty volume in an estate library. She thought about a mark that should not have been possible, and a warmth that had never gone out, and a low, steady hum that had persisted through 6 years of everything, through iron cuffs and exchange platforms and narrow windows facing stone walls, and had never once stopped reaching. The mark did not hum anymore. The mark did not need to. It had found what it was reaching for. She stood in the mountain night with silver eyes and her wolf singing beneath her skin, and the bond completed and settled and real, and Cain stood beside her, with the first fully unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face, and the mountains held them in their particular enormous quiet, and she was not broken, and she had never been broken, and the word that came to her finally, the right word, the one that fit, was not healed, not fixed, not restored. The word was arrived. She had arrived. And the mark on her shoulder was simply warm, simply present, simply, completely, entirely still. Because it was home.